Um, yeah, so my name is Anton Kittelberger, and I'm co-founder and co-CEO of a company called 9am Health. And what we really want to do is very much in line as to what you've been talking about, Chris. We really want to fight the inequalities in chronic care in the United States, um, which is very near and dear to my heart. I live with type 1 diabetes myself for over 30 years. And I've run a company called My Sugar before 9am Health, which is basically a digital diabetes management platform that now serves over 4 million people worldwide. And the US was one of our most important markets. And really there learned a lot about the healthcare system in the US, learned about how underinsured people have to deal with the healthcare system in the United States, and really struggle to put food on the table. And yeah, I think there's so much we can do, and I'm trying to do my share of what's possible to drive us to a better world in that sense.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me join. I'm a former Austinite, spent about 9 years in Austin, so it's great to be participating in the community virtually. I'd love to have an excuse to take a trip back, but the COVID world makes everything different, especially when you're living with diabetes in your life, because you're a little more cautious. So that kind of tees up my story. My son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2016 when he was 18 months old. Had a trip to Dell Medical Center, and our lives kind of changed forever at that point. We learned a lot. I really honestly didn't know a lot about diabetes at the time, but I did know tech. And when we had this onboarding experience, with air quotes, if you can see this, it didn't line up with my expectations given where we were with technology. And I think that was when the light bulb went off. So I immediately jumped into learning everything I could about diabetes tech, getting involved with the diabetes DIY innovation communities called We Are Not Waiting, and then ultimately had the opportunity to sell my previous startup and do something new. And when I did that, I knew I wanted to do something a little more impactful. I saw opportunities in the market to connect my background in the smart home to diabetes care, and started the company Better Living Technologies as part of the Techstars Austin program in 2018. So that's my short story. What we're trying to do is provide better interfaces to patients and their caregivers to alert them to critical events in their lives, starting with type 1 diabetes. Ultimately, we wanted to grow that towards a system of potentially digital nudging to help people just take better care of themselves. So that's our vision.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you both again for joining this panel discussions. First, Anton, I want to start with you. You bring a very unique perspective. Being from Austria, I believe you're zooming in right now from Austria, as they say.
I am.
In the European area. But I kind of want to get your take on what are some of the similarities, and maybe more importantly, the differences of diabetes in the EU area versus the US. And how does the EU handle some of these issues that we see in the underserved populations? And are there any lessons that maybe we in the US could take from the EU experiences?
Yeah, Chris, I'll try my best to answer that question. I think lots of policymakers have probably looked at different systems in Europe before, and tried to bring some of those ideas to the US. And I think most of that was not very successful. So I'll try to focus on the things that matter to drive us further. I think, first of all, it's a really two very different healthcare systems for the most part. Europe is very fragmented, but I think on the positive note, mostly everyone is covered by federal insurance, right? And I think people have heard that already. So the underserved community in terms of access to healthcare, that's just not as much of a problem in essence. And when you talk about diabetes, for the most part, everything that you need to survive with diabetes, and I would say getting the basics, that is all covered by insurance, and comes at no additional cost, no co-pays, no deductibles, kind of thing, right? It's all covered. There is no hidden cost, something that I think people have to deal with a lot in the US, which is not there in Europe for the most part. I would say that's the good side, I would say. But on the I would say where we in Europe can always look towards the US, and that's also why I've set up a company with my team in the US, and I'm actually moving to the US in a few months. I've just been kind of stuck due to COVID, but it's really about innovation, right? This system that is very much controlling all the elements and makes sure the prices stay low and people have access to all the elements of care in Europe. That does not allow for access to the money, to the buckets of these insurers. It's really hard to do, and therefore in the United States there's such a big problem with people just struggling to afford their medicines, afford their doctor visit, afford their laboratory results, even thinking about talking to a specialist, right? All of these things are really expensive, and there's just so much more that can be done here, and to make these things affordable. So that's a lot of these things I've seen over the last couple of years in my former company, and these dynamics. Also, when you look at the insurers in the US, that most of the times don't really have a significant interest in driving costs down, and what people are left with that situation that they struggle to put food on the table in order to finance. I would almost say, well, maybe a bit far to finance big salaries, shareholder bonus, and whatnot of insurance companies, right? And so that's really the issue that we want to take on with 9AM Health. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Well, speaking of 9AM Health, you just launched this company in September of this year. So to call it new is probably a vast understatement, clearly. But what I'm fascinated by is the focus on type 2 or insulin resistant people with diabetes. Not only does your organization company provide prescriptions, but the personal coaching, the management of disease. And I find that fascinating because there's been a lot of companies that want to provide general services along these lines. And I kind of want to get into really the process of how you came about through customer discovery and your eventual business model of how you came about going with type 2 and trying to serve this types of customers, really.
Yeah, good question. So we focus on people with pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And, I alluded to one problem that was really driving us to that area, which is the cost, right? And I just remember a user telling us that he spent $400 or he had to spend $400 on a primary care visit in order to get a prescription for his medication. And then he basically ended up not going there anymore and not taking his medication, for that matter, for a year until he found us, right? So that's kind of one element. So these situations are just mind-blowing. And then the other thing is healthcare is not only expensive, but healthcare also makes it really hard for you to take care of all the elements that you need to take care. If you live with a chronic condition, that means regularly going to the doctor, to the pharmacy, to the labs, and then ideally, if you can afford that, also having a specialist that really works with you on your lifestyle and all of these things. And we saw a huge opportunity here to drive down cost and to bring all of these elements into one service. And so with our service, we found a group of patients that on the one hand side really appreciates price, that the price is really important for them. And we found a way to bring down prices, and that we do that through leveraging doctors in a very efficient manner. We also only use generic medication at this point in time. We use at-home lab tests for the regular A1C testing, which are more affordable than the normal lab tests. And then we have a team of specialists that is there for you no matter what question you have. Basically, there's no referrals. They will, you ask the question and the right specialist will answer within very short period. And so it's really that combination of price and then the convenience to great access.
Wonderful. This is fantastic. And trust me when I say this, I hope this works. I really do. I hope this works. But my final follow-up question in this area is, have you looked into the underserved populations? Do you think this model can be applied to those rural communities and even urban communities along the lines there?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, right, we launched in September. The company's there since February, so we spent some time, actually making sure everything works well and we can serve our customers properly. And so far, I would say we're still in a customer discovery process, right? So we're still finding out where are most of our customers, and what we saw already is that more the suburban areas are more and more coming onto our site and then interested about the service. And it makes a lot of sense because for them, the next CVS is potentially not right around the corner, right? And the doctor is a bit more of a drive, and then you have to take time off of work to actually do all these appointments and things like that. So it makes a lot of sense. I would say we have not really figured out yet exactly how to get to those customers in an effective way, but I do think that we can have a huge impact there. So yeah, would almost, I mean, you're spending time on this topic and you're trying to move the needle. So I'd also be thankful for any hint, Chris, of how to approach people here in an effective manner.
That'd be great. That's why we're here, right? This is fantastic.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. Well, switch gears a little bit to Mike here. Mike, you found Better Living Technologies. Obviously, you have a very interesting background in IoT. And I just kind of want you to describe, obviously, kind of some of your background and why you came up with this, and just kind of what are some of the goals of your organization?
Yeah. So first of all, I spent a lot of that time that Anton was talking, just trying to equate this type 2 experience and prediabetes experience to type 1. And there are just so many similarities in the treatment, right? Because you have to get your labs done. It all comes down to cost and convenience. So, I mean, those are the 2 things I wrote down. So it's the same problem for people dealing with type 1, because you don't want to go through all those pains and spend more than you have to. And telemedicine has been revolutionary for that. And you can see all the rooms for improvement. But to answer your question, so my background for almost my entire career has been in software and IT. So my first real job was at Bell South, and they're what they called their Science and Technologies division, and that was basically R&D arm of AT&T now, where we were focused on smart home technologies and emerging technologies around the network. So Wi-Fi came through our lab before it was a standard. DSL and fiber to the home came through our lab before it was a standard. And basically got this crystal ball into the next 10 years of innovation, and we were looking at ways to basically leverage those technologies with services. So that's how I got into IoT before IoT was a thing. That's how I got into smart home before that was really a trend. And that's where my career was really focused up until 2017. My company in that space, my last company in that space, was focused on remote monitoring, because we had all these devices that you're putting in, especially large scale homes. And those devices would have problems, health issues, but in a different sense, a completely different sense. So a device would run out of memory, a processor would get overloaded, something needed to be rebooted, somebody would unplug something was always happening. And we developed a remote monitoring solution to monitor, alert, and then triage and even repair those problems remotely. But again, looking at devices and in the home, not people's health. But then when we got into the diabetes world through my son's diagnosis, we just had this technology hitting the market or gaining adoption in the market called continuous glucose monitor. And I latched on to that immediately. I said, I understand this. This is remote monitoring applied to people and their health rather than to devices and its health. So I fell in love with that technology and, again, got into this DIY community, this open source community of makers and hackers in the right way. And started to think about, well, where are all these opportunities to do better? how do you take some of these technologies that people are pushing the kind of the edges of innovation and disruption in this open source community? How do you bridge the gap and bring that from the fraction of a percent patient access to the majority of the patients out there in the world? And how do I combine my unique experiences and expertise with that? And really, that's what it was about. It was about how do we bring faster innovation from the things that are happening in this DIY community, mainly around people's lives, where they work, where they live, and on the go, to give them better access to that data, starting with the continuous glucose monitor. So it was a very simple use case to start, and it was actually one of the first use cases I used in the DIY arena. Is when my son's blood sugar went dangerously low at night. It's called nocturnal hypoglycemia, which is a mouthful. That happens. Your blood sugars, even as a normal person, fluctuate naturally and go down overnight, and you wake up low and a little hungry, right? But not dangerously low. And that's perfectly natural. Well, for people with type 1 diabetes, too much insulin and just the way their body's reacting, especially at their new diagnosis, they can go low and they can quite honestly never wake up. It's rare, but when you your old child, that's terrifying. And the first time you miss a diabetes alarm, and there's a whole other conversation around alarms, you don't sleep. And I wasn't sleeping because I turned my ringer off my phone and missed the alarm. And I looked around my room, and the first thing I did, I hooked up to a Pebble watch. And I said, maybe haptic will wake me up at night when this happens, and I don't have to worry so much about my phone. Every email I got, I woke up, and that didn't work so well overnight. And then I looked at my wall, and I'm like, well, I have this smart home system, and I have these smart lights. Can I connect the data to my lights? And the next day that was done. And turned out the next few nights I actually slept, and it was amazing. And I said, well, this is interesting. This is helpful for me. Do others need this help? And I looked at all the other interfaces in my life, and I said, well, can I connect it to my watch? Can I connect it to my computer? He's 102 right now. And that way I can go about my day and not have to stress over this and just keep doing what I need to do. But if something is wrong, I'm going to get alerted, and I can take care of it quickly. And then I have to look at what are the other data points you can put in here to give you two. It's helpful. Noyes 102 and steady is even better. Noyes 102 and dropping 24, different picture. But then knowing that he's got a unit of insulin on board at his size is even different. So can we get insulin data? Can we get activity, heart rate data into there and give parents and caregivers and patients better access to all this information in the place where they need it most? So it could be a smartwatch, it could be Alexa, it could be the lights, it could be your smart fridge, could be just a simple app on your phone. But that was really the vision. And then, of course, there's a whole other world of type 2 and needs to be more common. There's all kinds of other smart sensors and biosensors that are being developed in the world. And we thought there's plenty of opportunity to use this well beyond diabetes, but there's certainly a problem that I know and I'm really closely connected to and people could use, starting with type 1 diabetes. So long-winded answer to your question, but that's how I got here.
That's perfect, because this leads right to my next question is, especially in the data space, you can imagine we have very disjointed systems, separate apps, separate this, separate even hospital systems have their own software they talk to, right? And so, especially at our center, it's always about how do we notify people who went, when, where, why, how? And what do you see, Mike, as some of those challenges on data gathering? And more importantly, what do you do with this data, right?
Yeah.
And I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, in the ideal world, same app, same interface, no matter what the device, right? Yeah. So if I change because of personal preference, if I change because of insurance coverage, because one device just works better for me than others, I shouldn't have to be retrained. I shouldn't have to recalibrate. I shouldn't have to reshare. I shouldn't have to go through all the trouble of having to connect that data to my care team. That's just the way it should be. And that should be for my continuous glucose monitor. It should be for my fitness tracker. It should be for my insulin pumps or smart pens. There's no reason from a patient experience perspective and a physician experience perspective that shouldn't exist, hypothetically. So, and I think, I think that's where the problems start to come into play, especially when you're talking about regulated device data, getting access to that data as a third party. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it? Because we are also regulated by the FDA for our data streams. It really makes it challenging and it really slows things down. And some companies are willing to share that if you're able to go through their process, to put it nicely, to get access to that information, and others aren't. So to create this consistent interface across devices is really, really challenging, because you've got regulation, you've got politics, and you've got natural barriers in the way, and unnatural ones at the same time. So yeah, it's probably the biggest challenge that we've faced. And that's just on the inputs. Getting access to the outputs and the interfaces has been not as challenging, but more challenging than I would have expected.
Yeah, interesting. And Anton, it's interesting hearing all the challenges we have with just data and sharing data, all these silos. Is this something you're also seeing in the EU market?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's almost no difference. And also, Mike, I feel for you. I feel with you. At my previous company, at My Sugar, we had exactly that problem all the time. We were one of the first companies at the time that had a deal with Abbott to get their data in real time. That changed after we were acquired by Roche at the time. But yeah, so I think there's little difference. The main players are the same players in Europe, like they are in the US. Of course, there is more complexities if you run a business across US and Europe in terms of segregating data and kind of having HIPAA on the one side and then GDPR on the other side. So that's just really privacy issues. But yeah, I think the access is very much similar, and that's also why we've seen, I would say, such a big success in the DIY community, where these are unregulated devices. Of course, it's a bit dangerous to use those devices. I do it myself, right, as a type 1, because it's just so important to have all your data in one place, and it's just wrong to box people into one system that might not work for their lives.
And I don't think the problem gets any easier, because every year the Diabetes Mind puts on an event where they bring industry and innovators and patients together to have conversations. And one of the sessions, it's tomorrow and Friday. One of the sessions on Friday is something like, I think the title's 30 Emerging Continuous Glucose Monitor Companies. So right now you've got 3 or 4 that dominate the market, but when you have 30, this problem is going to get even worse. So it's certainly a problem that needs to be solved. The question is when's going to be the tipping point.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's true. The interesting thing is, though, as competition increases, also with the bigger ones, the smaller ones will look for differentiation. And I think that the data access to other platforms that might already have customer bases will actually lead to more open sharing of data and increased pressure on those that are more prohibitive with data sharing. And I think it's really important to remind these companies that the data belongs to the patients, right? And kind of boxing them in is just unethical.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, interesting how similar issues between 2 different continents here. This is very, very interesting. But I also, and Mike, I'm going to flip this back to you just because it's very, very topical right now. Finally, we passed the big infrastructure bill here in the United States. President Biden finally signed off on it. In there is massive funding for greater internet connectivity within our rural communities, even urban communities. Probably just an example of Washington, D.C. itself. It's one thing to kind of lay the groundwork, right? It's another of, okay, now how do we take that next steps in those underserved communities? And what do you see as maybe some of those possible paths to, yes, they have the access, but now how do we make use of it? And I think this ties in back to the data, everything data, really.
Yeah. Well, your statistic to start with, I think it was roughly 60%, and the underserved population said internet connectivity. Like, that's, in a country like the U.S., that's shocking. We should be far beyond that. But it's the problem in front of us, and it's reality. But that just enables a little better access to care, right? Because now they can take advantage of things like virtual visits and remote monitoring technologies that maybe they didn't have access to, or data, just the ability to look up carb count information. So you're not having to do it the old fashioned way. It requires connectivity, which I'm sure a lot of patients use their cell phones on. So I think it's an important step, but I don't know how much that helps the problem, because the problem is, how do you help people make better decisions that are going to make them healthier? And that's type 1 and type 2. So when you talk about, how do we help underserved populations with better decisions based on their CGM data, a lot of that is coaching them to make better food choices. But do they have the ability to do that? Do they have the time to do that? Do they have the money to buy healthier food options? Do they have the nutritionists to help coach them? Well, why is white bread worse than whole wheat toast? Or why is a low carb bread better for my health? They don't have access to any of that information. So I think a lot of the problems are in that access around the solution, not necessarily to the data around the problem. That's where I started. It's great. I mean, I think we need to solve the digital divide for so many reasons, and that'll enable better use cases and better tools for people. But I think the harder problem is just simple things like, how do you convince them to be healthier? How do you help them be healthier?
Great.
If I may ask a question here, the 60%, how does that compare to the mobile connectivity? How far are we there?
So it's interesting, in our center's research, 80% in the underserved populations probably have a smartphone. The problem is the data plans. Mm-hmm. The problem becomes these people don't want to use up their data plans. So they don't want to really connect to something that's going to burn all that time up. So now what do we try to do, right? How do we try to overcome some of those things? Do we talk to a Verizon, for instance? Are there some better ways of transmitting that data that aren't so, streaming heavy, right? Along those lines. So again, I think it's getting a little bit more underneath the surface and really understanding those communities. What are some of those issues? We've discovered that people won't even answer a phone if they don't recognize the number, right? So how do you overcome those types of barriers along those lines?
I would, and I think the other challenge there, you're right, because data in the US is still expensive. That's where a lot of the carriers are making their money, through data caps. And so for them to purchase more data, it's something they don't want to do. So they're going to wait till they have connectivity. They're going to turn off the apps that use data. And unfortunately, as a technologist, I can tell you that a CGM packet is small, right? It's just a little bit of data, but most people have no idea how to relate that to streaming video. They just don't know. So they'll by default probably turn off things that seem chatty to them, even though it's low amounts of bandwidth. So that's a big problem, I think, in those populations too.
Yeah, correct. Well, I'm going to switch this to common topics for both gentlemen here. So the first topic I want each of you to talk about here is COVID, especially in the US. I'm sure in the EU, has exposed a lot of health disparities, especially in the diabetes space that I mentioned earlier. But there's been some good things, maybe especially in the US. Acceptance of telehealth, not only by the patients, the MDs, and more importantly, the payers. They're paying for these types of things, right? There's been documented huge investments in point of care space. For us on the regulatory, FDA's willingness to be, quote, more flexible with providing maybe additional guidance, the emergency use authorization tags that we're all familiar with right now, along those lines. And I just want to kind of maybe, what are some of the lessons that we can apply that we're coming out of COVID now, that we can maybe move forward here with diabetes management, whether that be type 1, type 2. And Anton, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think you covered already a lot. So let me build on top of that, right? I just remember one number that I saw, which was that basically in 2020 we have 76% of people, it was a study that was released, I think, from McKinsey, it was like 76% of people are interested in telehealth in 2020. And that is up from something like 10 or 11% just a year before that, right? And so I think what that does is it's changing a paradigm, right? It's changing, it's probably building in the growth that we would have had over maybe 10 years or so into basically 1 year. And so I think the opportunity is tremendous. That also means the need is just really, really big, right? And I think we have a real opportunity to take the positive things here. And I would say we kind of took on telehealth and visits with physicians during that time because we had no other way, right? But then now people realize there is more to it, right? There is a way that I can do these visits asynchronously. There's a way that I can do a video call, maybe just while I'm commuting or whatever. There's it suddenly fits into your daily life. And that's a huge opportunity to reach people that we before were not able to reach, right? That simply passed on a doctor visit. They passed on on picking up their medication on the right time in order to have the adherence and are treated well. So I just think while COVID was, of course, or is still a terrible thing, and very happy that we have vaccines to counter that. There's just so much opportunity that was created out of that, and I think I look forward to that new world in terms of applying digital health tools to our everyday lives. I think this can only improve.
Yeah, and Mike?
Lots to say. Plenty to say.
That's
good. One of the things we have to do is improve the reliability of experience, because I don't know if you noticed, but my connection just dropped, and I'm in a good area. So if you think about patients in not so great areas and rural communities, like how do you provide a good experience through telemedicine and telehealth? Like that's one of the things we definitely need to address. But just going beyond that, COVID was certainly a catalyst for telemedicine and telehealth. In so many ways, it forced us to do it. It forced us to try it. It forced physicians to figure out their workflows around it and embrace embrace the technology. Just to get a laptop with a good camera and microphone was a big step forward, and they were forced to do that. It forced reimbursement to be put in place, which would have taken who knows how long without COVID. It's been here long enough that it's hopefully here to stay, because I know that we had a lot of questions around that. It eased restrictions around HIPAA and the requirements to use certain platforms just to give people the care they wanted. So hopefully people understand there's not a lot of risk in some of the other tools now. But I think it's got a long way to go just around improving the experience because convenience is a huge problem. So how do we take that and give people more convenient access to labs, so I don't have to go to the lab just to get an A1C, because that at this point in life, I haven't seen my son's endocrinologist ever in Florida. We've never met her, but we know her and she knows us, and it's been great. So how do you take that further? How do you take that to prescriptions and refills and easing the pain around that, especially in the U.S. where you've got insurance claims denied constantly? I think there are lots of ways to continue to build on it. How do you get more connection to specialists for coaching, for data reviews? I don't know that people actually knew that you could upload your device data without going to your doctor's office and handing over the device to the doctor, because here in the US, that's how you traditionally did it. But with telemedicine, they're like, okay, download this app, upload the data, we can see it. And you're like, huh. So if I have a question in 2 weeks from now, can I call you? And they say, sure. A lot of patients had no idea they could do that in between their regular doctor visits. So I think it's opened up people's eyes, and it's really been a great forcing function. As bad as the pandemic still is, it's definitely been a good thing for remote medicine, remote health.
Yeah, Mike, I would say you almost made my pitch for my new company there. Thank you.
I live the problems every day, and I think most people do, right? Especially in the U.S., like the number of people with chronic disease is huge.
Yeah.
So,
it's amazing.
frustrating.
It's amazing. Next question here, and I'm glad both of you have this the type 1 experience here. But this goes back to, there's been a lot of research and technologies focused on type 1. That's been very historic for a long time. But I think it's fair to say there's been a lot of difficulty in translating those technologies to type 2s or insulin resistant people. The numbers show the type 2 market is very large, type 1's not so big, blah, blah, blah. But that's not due to lack of effort. Industry has been trying for a long time. But what do you see as some of those reasons behind those difficulties? And maybe Anton, I'd like to get your perspective on that. Maybe obviously from the US, but maybe a little EU, and are there commonalities there?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, I don't know if it's really best to put me as the Europe expert, because most of my career is actually focused on the US. But
you're only one.
I can always try and give you my personal perspective, because I'm of course also a user of the healthcare system still in Europe. Yeah. Here the adoption, I would say, in terms of people with type 2 is by far not great of these new technologies. I think, as I said in the beginning, right, the market is very reluctant to take on innovation. And it's not easy to just tap into another user group, right? So there's lots of barriers put in place so that companies basically cannot simply expand to customer groups for profit. Basically, there's a lot of barriers in place. So I would say, for example, if you look at CGM, of course, one of the major innovations over the last years, really transforming our lives as people living with type 1 diabetes. More and more people with type 2 diabetes are also tackling or having the money to try those, right? Because we're just at the start of some insurance companies covering maybe intermittent use for people with type 2, and so they get to get their feet wet and understand what these systems are doing, it's a huge potential. And I've just personally ran a survey before we started our new company, and there's already quite some knowledge around CGMs, right? So there's already quite some knowledge that these exist, even amongst type 2s and people with prediabetes, that they exist. And there's a very high willingness to try. I think in the survey group that we did, it was a small n, something like 100, but we had like 80% willing to try. But if we then told them the price that they would have to pay out of pocket for this, then this willingness to try dropped to basically a 1-digit percentage, right? So here there is the barrier, right? The barrier is price, it's cost. In order to try these technologies, right now there's little reimbursement for it, and there's a lot of value even using them in intermittent ways to understand how your body reacts, how foods react, and basically use that to build habits, and then maybe half a year later take another sensor and see what's going on. So I think we can do a lot more about that, and educating people that that's a very smart way to learn how your body works. There is many companies that are trying to go into that space more, I would say, in the lifestyle areas that use this for athlete kind of things. But we'll see more and more coming in the prediabetes and type 2 space as well.
Great. And Mike?
Yeah, I mean, those are all really good points. Just to continue on the topic with the health and conscious, and I see it as a good thing. So you've got companies like Levels and Super Sapiens and NutriSense and all these companies that are spending a lot of money on marketing and advertising. They're actually breaking down one of the biggest barriers to adoption of a CGM in the type 1 patient population, and that was aesthetics. They didn't like the cyborg look, but all of a sudden the cyborg look, especially for teenagers, is cool. So you've broken down one barrier. Thankfully, at the same time, those devices are getting a lot smaller and a lot more conspicuous. Because another thing that, especially if you've been in the world for a while, seeing a CGM in the wild is like spotting a unicorn. But now it's not. You feel a little more normal when you see somebody with it on. So I think those are real world barriers to adoption. Comfort was also another, but again, as size comes down, that goes away. Accuracy is another thing we're addressing, or the CGM companies are addressing, and new ways of measurement, I think, will be part of the future. So that's fantastic to see as well. All that will lead to broader adoption. That will drive down price. That will improve access. I think that's what I'm excited about there. But it all has to be reliable, and I think this experience has to be improved too, especially for people who are going to wear these devices every single day. Yeah, I could keep going, but I think that's a good answer there.
That's an excellent time, because I just want to maybe another question for both of you here is and this leads to CGM. CGMs have revolutionized management of type 1. No one can deny that. New insights into this now time and range that is complementing A1Cs. Dexcom, Abbott, you see these being advertised in televisions and all over the place. There's tons of more startups, as you mentioned before, trying to get in the CGM space along those lines. But there seems to be, I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier, reluctance in the type 2 market to try them. But do you see other barriers, maybe from the payers, or are there some other barriers we need to identify to really, not just even the CGMs that have shown to really make an impact and provide greater insight? And I'll start with Mike this time.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
I was cutting out a bit, so I appreciate Mike taking it first.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges that I see with anybody adopting CGM is I've got the data, now what? Like, what do I do with that information? Who's going to support me to understand that, to translate that to action? So I think that's a problem. And then to show improved outcomes is going to require somebody actually doing that and taking action on that data. But I think one of the more important leaps that we'll have to take is, how do we also help people treat and titrate themselves with that data better? So I think closing the loop in the type 2 space is actually going to be a big part of this. And it doesn't have to be a closed loop or an automated insulin delivery system, quite as sophisticated as what we do with type 1s, but just helping them make better dosing decisions when they pull out the insulin pen and do the calculations for them and things like that. Based on that, I think of the CGM data as the output data. Based on that output data is a big improvement. So I really think automated insulin delivery and just building on that technology is a big part of the future for both type 1 and type 2. Because just knowing what your blood sugar is one thing, knowing how to improve it's another, and then knowing how to dose and treat better is, I think, going to make an even bigger improvement that hopefully will convince people to pay more for those devices, those people being the payers.
Yeah. And Anton?
Yeah, I mean, what I would add is, as you said, with the automatic insulin delivery systems, what I think also from my personal perspective, right, one of the biggest levers that we have is carbs. So if you get the carbs right, then these systems will take care of you, right? So that's at least my personal perspective, and therefore you try to stay with foods that you understand. You make sure that you kind of don't go too far on the experimentation side. That will throw you off completely, and then you have several hours of not feeling great. And I think we can look at that, and I think that's maybe the real commonality with with type 2s actually. So if you're insulin resistant, the foods that take type 1 completely out of range, it's the same thing for somebody living with insulin resistance. And so I think you get rid of all the insulin stuff that is very much on factors and calculation and whatnot. But if you manage to basically show CGMs in conjunction with carbs and how they're being absorbed in your body and what that does to you and how fast that increases, and you start to show people some patterns, I think then we're starting to approach a real aha moment, and that triggers hopefully lifestyle change. And I think some easy tweaks there can mean so much for people with prediabetes and type 2. So they need to go through that experience, and that experience also needs to be an enjoyable one, because if you start to put on that sensor and it's really complicated and it hurts, and you don't really know how to put the transmitter in and things like that, right? So those are real barriers for a first good experience. And if you have that first good experience, then comes hopefully behavior change and continuous usage.
Yeah, the term that I liked was Diabetes Geek Squad. We almost need a Diabetes Geek Squad to get these people onboarded, like patients onboarded, so that it's a good experience. And I love that coming from the tech world. And I also like that behavior change aspect. I think the challenge is that's not going to be the solution for everybody. Some patients, it's a lot harder to change their habits, but it's a good start, especially for the people who will. One of the things we did was connect the CGM data to smart lights that change colors based on your blood sugar ranges. So going back to that time and range point, and when blood sugars were above 260, the light goes purple. When it's below 54, the light goes red. And people can start to see, as they eat a banana in real time, what happens to their blood sugar visually through a color, passively in their home, rather than having to look at their CGM and see what just happened and do that through numbers. Because some patients just don't associate numbers. Like if you ask them, what is 260 healthy or not healthy, they'll have a hard time with that, but everybody knows red is bad. So I think there are unique ways you can digitally nudge people to encourage those behaviors and help them learn in real time or become aware in real time of how their decisions influence their health.
Yeah, that's great. And just to parrot you on that, Mike, through our research in the Underserved, there's a lot of number illiteracy in some of these underserved populations. So to say, yeah, keep your blood sugars between 80 and 120, and they have this meter and it punches up 150, they don't know. They're like, is that good or bad? And so that's like you said, Mike, that's a step back. They go, well, wait a second, maybe we need to do green, yellow, red, a more positive experience than a number, which can be a challenge for a lot of these people here. So I think that speaks to that. And the final moments here, gentlemen, I'm going to flip the script a little bit. Go ahead and ask me maybe some questions of our center, some of the more technologies we're working on, and maybe what we're seeing. Maybe Anton, you can maybe ask away on that.
Yeah, I'll repeat my question from before, right? So I think that the underserved communities would profit a lot from what we do at 9am Health. And so what do you think are effective ways to find those people and tell them about our service?
That's an excellent question, and to be specific, especially maybe you got to go very regional. We have a lot of connections here in Healthy South Texas, where we've been in these communities, especially through Texas A&M, with these community leaders that they trust us, right? And especially in these communities, it's all about trust. If you just showed up and knock on the door, you're a complete stranger, they're going to go, well, who are you? But if someone says, hey, Anton's here, I know him, I think he has something, that's a different conversation, right? And so again, if you work, especially regionally, work with some of these community leaders, and there's all sorts of connections that we can make here. But that's really the key, because then these communities don't feel like you're just kind of using them, right? You're actually here to help. And if saying, somebody that I know knows Anton, okay, he's coming here, I think he's going to help. And that's really an important aspect, especially in these underserved communities, in the Texas area, especially as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mike, you have a question for me?
Yeah. Again, all kinds of questions, but I think the one I'm most excited about asking, because I'm a geek at heart, given the remote patient monitoring center and all the research you're doing there, what most excites you about the future of technology and innovation based on what you're working on?
What most excites me, and this is the work we're doing at the center, is going beyond basic CGMs and just glucose monitoring. What can we infer besides just blood sugar? Can we infer macronutrients? In other words, high fat, high carb, high protein. Can you infer that? And that'll help with and back to Anton's, how many carbs am I taking here? I took a different type of pasta. These types of things. This will help. Can we infer when a person just ate a meal? And that's pretty important for the type 1s. CGMs get fooled. They don't know if that's just a spike or is that no, if someone just ate. We're also bringing these CGMs into pre-diabetes type 2s and doing some studies during the night. And we're noticing things that maybe during normal ranges or normal kind of views, this person is not really drifting. They seem to be okay. But then we take a different snapshot, and now all of a sudden, wait a second. No, this person is drifting. And so then can you apply some of those behavioral changes? Can you do some things to really try to reverse the course of type 2 diabetes, get them back into remission versus them just somehow continuing on and doing these other things? So I really think some of these more novel ways of applying some of these technologies, other than just creating something new and better, right? How do you branch out? Also looking at different biomarkers, looking at some of these other different things other than A1Cs, looking at non-invasive measurements. But that's what excites me in the future.